Hi, everyone. Good evening. So it is a great honor, a great pleasure to open talk number 7 of this series that has been going on since March this year. Reading in interfaces. Oh, wait. Sorry. I had YouTube open here. Very sorry about that. Okay, so the event is called Reading in Interfaces, Theories, Methods, and Applications, celebrating the 50th anniversary of the postgraduate program in English, the PGI, which was founded in 1971. So you all know that our program is respected all over Brazil, that we have more than 500 doctoral dissertations, MA thesis defended, almost 300 dissertations. So we have a lot to celebrate. And this virtual event is organized by Maternal Depression, de Estudos Leitura, under my coordination, and Gente, from PUC, Rio Grande do Sul, Grupo de Estudos em Neurolinguística e Psicolinguística, coordinated by my colleague Lilian Christine Ubner, with the support of Programa de Pós-Graduação in Inglês. Yes, so thank you, Harissa, for the support. Thank you, Tatiana, for helping with the organization of the event. So we would like to thank Dr. Denise Neumann for having accepted our invitation so promptly, and for being here today, for sharing some of her knowledge on this very interesting topic with us. I would also like to thank the audience here at Zoom and also on YouTube. So you can place your questions on both, here, Zoom and YouTube, and Tatiana will place the questions here after Dr. Neumann finishes her talk. And my colleague Ingrid Finger is going to mediate the section, and I will just introduce her right after the talk, okay, so that she can mediate the session. So Denise Neumann is working as a research fellow in the Growing Up in New Zealand study at the School of Population Health, Vaipapa Taumata Rao, Maori language, the University of Auckland, supporting the psychosocial and cognitive development domain, as well as the Maori theme of the study. She has previously done her PhD in psychology using the Growing Up in New Zealand data, focusing on cognitive functioning in early and middle childhood. Before she came to Aotearoa, New Zealand, she was working as a research fellow at the Institute for Rehabilitation Medicine at the Martin Luther University, Halle-Wittenberg in Germany, concentrating on neurocognition and psychosocial well-being in chronic kidney disease patients. Her current research interests include neurocognition in children who have experienced prenatal alcohol exposure, self-control development in early and middle childhood, associations between bilingualism, dyslexia, and cognition, bilingualism and multilingualism in children growing up in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So it is a great pleasure to have Dr. Neumann here with us today. So I'll just give her the floor, and I'm going also to close my camera. So welcome, Denise. Thank you very much for having accepted to be here today. Okay, so the floor is yours.
Muito obrigada, Leda. Boa tarde, boa noite. Kia ora from New Zealand. Greetings to everyone, and thank you so much, Leda, for this introduction and the invitation to this seminar. I'm really honored to be invited to this. I'm really excited to share some of my research with you. So thank you very much for that. And also thank you everyone being on the Zoom and in the live stream for your interest in this topic. And I will start sharing my presentation now. So hopefully that should all work. Yeah, so as Leda has introduced, I'm working in a growing up in New Zealand study and also did my PhD work in the study. And what I'm going to present to you today is a bit of this work. And the topic is antenatal and perinatal risk factors for receptive language and executive control in preschool children. And yeah, so starting with a little bit of a background, why we're actually interested in this kind of research, or where does the idea come from. And the theoretical background here is that child development in general, but also cognitive development, is embedded in a wider system. And here Bronfenbrenner's bioecological model is shown, which can explain child development and cognitive development. So we have our individual, so we have several factors that influence the cognitive development. So we have our individual with mostly biological factors, but the individual obviously grows up in a certain environment, in an immediate environment, which is obviously in those very early years, mainly the family. But it starts already with the intrauterine environment, which is actually the first environment that the child or the fetus is exposed to. And then it goes on, obviously those different environments interact with each other. And then there's also a more distal environment involved. So the neighborhood, access to social services, to health, the area that someone is living in, what is the deprivation in this area, and obviously that all is embedded in a larger social and cultural context. So the development doesn't happen in isolation. We have individual biological factors, but then we also have an immediate or in a more distal environment involved. And so this is kind of a little bit the background why we looked at certain factors in our study. So yeah, as mentioned, the first kind of environment the child or the fetus is exposed to is the intrauterine environment. And there has been an abundance of research actually around this, and it has been found that this period is really critical for brain and cognitive development. So it has been found that exposure to certain teratogens, for example, like smoking cigarettes or drinking alcohol during pregnancy, can actually have detrimental effects on a child's development in general, but also the cognitive development. But it's not just limited to those kind of environmental factors. Obviously, there are others, drugs and toxins, pollution, and so on. But it is also, it's not just that physical exposure, or those physical factors. It is also increasingly awareness that it is also maternal mental health characteristics that might affect the child's cognitive development. So if the mother is experiencing antenatal depression, antenatal anxiety, or stress during pregnancy, that might also impact on the child's cognitive development. And while those kind of effects have been found, as I mentioned, those were more the adverse effects, but there are also positive or beneficial factors. For example, a very healthy diet can be beneficial, and specifically taking certain vitamins during pregnancy can be beneficial. For example, folic acid has been found to be an important vitamin during pregnancy for the fetal development. And while those effects have been found in general, it is also, it appears that there are really also different stages in the fetal development that play a role. So it, depending on what stage, those kind of factors, beneficial or detrimental, might have a stronger or weaker effect. So for example, in those very, very early days where there is no connection yet to the placenta, some effects might not yet happen, versus then in some of the earlier stages, once that connection is done, the effects, for example, from alcohol exposure might be more detrimental in those earlier stages versus in later stages, and others as well. So it is also that to keep in mind. It's not just effects in general, it is also might be a critical stage that plays a role. Yeah, and so as mentioned, there's an abundance of research on those different factors. So we have studies looking at maternal depression, how does that predict young children's cognitive functioning, and also in different areas. So we have associations with executive functioning, we have associations with overall IQ, with language, vocabulary, reading abilities in those early years. And yeah, so we have a lot of studies on those teratogens, smoking, alcohol, maternal mental health, as well as the folic acid supplementation. And in addition to those antenatal factors, it has also been found that events or features around the birth, perinatal factors play a role. So it is, for example, a low birth weight, being born preterm, being born small for gestational age as well. So while there's kind of broad evidence on that, what happened is that those studies often were focused on those factors in isolations. We have studies on alcohol and cognitive functioning, we have studies on depression and cognitive functioning, and so on. But it never really has been looked in a broader sense, like what, because obviously those kind of factors might co-occur. So it is likely that those risk factors accumulated. So a child that is exposed to smoking might also be more likely to be exposed to alcohol. If the mother is experiencing depression, maybe she's more likely also to experience anxiety and stress, or have very difficult circumstances related to the environment. So all those kind of factors don't happen in isolation, but there might be co-occurrences, associations. So we can't, in order to really make conclusions, we can't just look at them in isolation, but should look at them a little bit more in a multivariate approach. And this was kind of the background for why we wanted to do this study. So what are the antenatal and perinatal predictors of receptive language and inhibitor control in preschool age children from a multivariate and longitudinal aspect? So we wanted to look at a range of those factors together. And how could we do that? Because obviously there's a lot of information that might be actually very difficult to gather. We were lucky that we could use the data from the Growing Up in New Zealand data. And a little bit of background around this study, because it is quite a unique study actually. It is the largest contemporary study on child development in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So while there have been obviously also previous longitudinal studies, they were often smaller in sample size, and one other, and obviously older. So it's different growing up now in Aotearoa, New Zealand compared to maybe 20 or 30 years ago. So there was kind of a need for a new longitudinal study. And also when it comes to our population, so obviously there are changes, and the limitations of those earlier studies weren't maybe as representative of the current New Zealand population, and also as we have an indigenous population, Maori people here in New Zealand, they were often not really represented as much in those earlier studies. So hence there was a need for a new longitudinal study growing up in New Zealand, and in 2009 the study started recruiting. And even though those areas might not tell you that much, but just to give you a little bit of an impression, this is the North Island of New Zealand, and this circle shows where we have recruited, and it just to demonstrate it was quite a large area in order to make sure we really get this population, this representation of the population. And yeah, who do we actually have in the study? So it was over 10,000 moms while they were pregnant were contacted, so anyone, so there was no exclusion criteria. And it ended up 6,822 women enrolled and completed the antenatal, the first interview. And also unique to the study as well, that it was over 4,000 of the partners of the mothers that were enrolled as well. And then we have quite a range of age. And in total, then we had 6,846 babies. Obviously, there were a couple of twins and triplets, and 52 of them were male. And so that is quite a large number. And then again, looking at our ethnicity, the ethnicity distribution in the sample, we see that we have 18% Maori, 62% European, 17% Pacific people, 16% Asian, and then also kind of a little bit of a mixed category from Statistics New Zealand, Middle Eastern, Latin American, and African, and other ethnicities. So it's really, really representative of the current population, as well as not just from ethnicity, but also when it comes to socioeconomic status. And this is, yeah, one of the big advantages of this study. So what information was gathered in this huge study? And we have several research domains and themes for this study. So again, really important were those kind of cultural lens. So we had for our four main or major ethnic groups, we had so-called themes. So we have a Maori theme, an Asian theme, Pacific, and a European. And those kind of themes weave through all the information that is gathered, because obviously in everything that is collected, there will be cultural differences and aspects that need to be considered. And so the information of interest, was six broad areas: health and well-being, so everything related to general health, nutrition, access to services, and so on. We also have an education domain, and obviously, depending on how old our cohort is, so the children are now turning 12, so obviously now an education domain is much more important than in those earlier years. We also collect heaps of information on the societal and neighborhood context. We also don't just want to know about those children, but also really about their family and wider family context, because obviously everything is embedded. And then also a culture and identity domain. Who are our children? How are they identifying? And then last and not least, but what is relevant for this study mainly is the psychosocial and cognitive development. So really studying very early on, we gathered information first from the moms and the partners about their mental health and well-being, but then also really early on starting to ask about the children's communication, psychomotor development. And then as early as the children were 2 years old, we also started with observations of the children. So interviewers really conducting child observations to gather information on their neurocognitive development. So really exciting and comprehensive information that we have in this study. And how was this information gathered? So we had, as I mentioned, so the children are now turning 12, and we have so far completed the data collection waves up until they were 8 years old. And there were four main data collection was, where the interviewers really went into the homes, conducted the interviews with the moms, with the partners, and then also did the observations of the children. So we had that at the antenatal, at the 9 months when the children were 2 years, 4.5 years, and also the latest one when they were 8 years old. But in between, we still, got in touch with the families and via either electronic interviews or also via telephone interviews. And in addition to all that, also there was a range of information gathered via data linkage, routine health data, for example, perinatal information, the child's gender and perinatal characteristics. So there's a lot of rich information we could use here. And that's what enabled us to do our study. And mainly of interest for this study, obviously, was the cognitive testing at the 4.5 years. So as I mentioned, at that time, we started doing direct child observations, which obviously gives more information than just asking the parents themselves in a report. So, the first one that was of interest for the study was the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test in order to assess receptive vocabulary. And this is an slightly adapted version, a shortened version from the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test that has been used in an Australian longitudinal study before. So we kind of always had to weigh getting rich information versus also keeping the interviewer burden as low as possible. We couldn't do, the study is not just about cognitions. We couldn't do a half-hour cognitive observation. We had to fit it in with many other things that were assessed as well. So that's why we always try to, find the balance between those tools, maybe in a shortened version, in order to not overload our participants. And so the shortened version worked in a way that the children were presented with 4 pictures at once. And the interviewer was reading out a word. So the child could only hear that word and then had to point to the picture that would match the word they were hearing. So and if they didn't know, they were encouraged to choose the picture that they would think most likely was matching that word. And then in total, 40 items were used. So we still had quite a bit of information, and then an overall score of the vocabulary was calculated, and it was in English only. So that's also important to mention. That's for Peabody Picture. And then we also had a test for executive or inhibitory control with the so-called Luria hand clap task. And this task is an adaptation from the Luria pencil task, which works in a similar way, but the child has to hold a pen in the original version, which is part of the Luria Nebraska neurocognitive battery. But we considered that there might be differences in how used children are to holding a pen. So there might be differences just because of that factor. And so in order to avoid that, the task was slightly changed into a hand clap task. And basically the instruction was the interviewer clapped once and the child in response had to clap twice, and vice versa. When the interviewer clapped twice, the child had to clap once. So, and that is kind of a relatively easy and child-appropriate way to get this inhibitory control, this impulse to imitate the same action that the interviewer does. So that was a really nice way to get that, and was engaging and fun for the children as well. And then overall, we had 16 of those claps, which also then was generated an overall score. So those were our 2 tasks of interest at 4.5 years. And then we looked at the frequency in terms of how many of the children performed below average. And as you can see, it's approximately 20% for both tasks, which appears quite high. So we also thought, oh, that's quite a high number, but looking at other data, this is actually a relatively, it's a typical distribution. So that was in line with other studies for this age group. And we were particularly interested in those below average. So it was one standard deviation below average. So we were particularly interested in those ones and the associations with those antenatal and perinatal risk factors. So we didn't just want to look at what's the general association with cognition, with cognitive function, because there probably is one anyways, but we were really interested, what is it, what are the factors that are actually associated with that below average performance? So really, what is the risk factor for being in a below average range? So that's why we use that dichotomization. And yeah, so as demonstrated, we had quite a bit of information from growing up in New Zealand, and so we could look at a range of those factors that had been previously in the literature identified as being associated with a higher risk for poor cognitive functioning. So we looked at smoking pre-pregnancy, during pregnancy, and also secondhand smoke exposure, because there's, even though findings are still, some find effects, some don't, but we thought we would like to include this, whether secondhand smoke in addition has an effect. We also looked at the antenatal alcohol consumption, as well as the folate intake, and we actually were lucky to be able to look at different stages of the folate intake, so pre-pregnancy, first trimester, and the second trimester, which was really, really great. And we also included antenatal depression, antenatal anxiety, and antenatal stress experience as reported by the mothers. As for perinatal characteristics, we included birth weight, gestational age, and birth complications, which also has been found to be linked to later cognitive functioning. And again, thanks to this comprehensive study and the rich information, we were also able to control for a range of socio-demographic variables, because as shown earlier, everything is embedded in a larger system. So we could look at control for socioeconomic status, maternal age, maternal education, rurality, ethnicity, and here just really wanting to mention or highlighting, it's not that we're assuming any direct effect of ethnicity per se, but just already in the nature of the measures, there might be a cultural bias. As mentioned, the instruction, everything is in English. We had a lot of bicultural, bilingual children and so on. So all those factors play a role, and obviously also way more structural inequities that might affect certain access and so on, which all might affect the outcome. So it's definitely not an ethnicity per se that we were looking for, but it can be an important indicator of any structural inequities and differences we might not capture with other variables. Then also child gender, there have been found that there might be differences, especially when it comes to, even though again, it's not necessarily a biological effect, it is more often a social, kind of a social expectation effects. For example, that often it has been found that girls are performing better when it comes to reading activities versus boys tend to be a bit better when it comes to more spatial tasks. But then again, it's really controversially discussed and could definitely be mainly an effect of society norms and parenting in that regard. But nonetheless, we controlled for it, as well as parity and whether the pregnancy has been planned. Again, parity, there has been found that it can be an effect that sometimes the firstborn child is better performance, especially again when it comes to vocabulary, because their engagement obviously is more with older, the parents mainly, versus the subsequent children have much more interaction with the younger children. And then also we control for any developmental concerns, hearing, visual concerns, any motor problems, and so on, to rule out the effects that might have on their performance. Yeah, and then looking at the results, starting with receptive language, here we found that smoking pre-pregnancy, as well as antenatal anxiety, were associated with increased odds of below average performance in receptive language. And in addition, we found that taking folate acid but only during the first trimester, was associated with the lower odds, decreased odds of below average receptive language. So in that sense, the folate intake during first trimester was a protective factor, a beneficial factor for the cognitive performance, versus smoking pre-pregnancy and antenatal as a risk factor. Looking at executive control, we found that smoking during pregnancy, as well as a low birth weight, was associated with an increased risk of below average executive control performance. And again, folate intake during first trimester was a protective factor or beneficial factor associated with a lower risk for below executive control. So yeah, what does that mean, putting that together? So we found that the antenatal and perinatal environment has an effect on early childhood receptive language and executive control. And in particular, we found for poorer outcomes, we found, so low folate intake, so if the moms didn't take it, smoking pre and during pregnancy. And here I must say, while in that first one, we only found the pre-pregnancy, also, again, this might be interrelated. Someone who's smoking pre-pregnancy is probably much more likely to smoke during pregnancy. So this could be also, be a co-occurrence. So not saying it's just pre-pregnancy or it's just during pregnancy. It's definitely interlinked. But again, for both outcomes, we found the smoking to be important. Maternal mental health, with anxiety playing a role, as well as low birth weight being a risk factor. And again, also highlighting the low folate intake for both outcomes playing a role. And that is really kind of remarkable, finding that on that behavior test level. So that's really one thing that we, with the Growing Up in New Zealand study, in other areas as well, behavior. There was a study that folate acid intake, especially during that first trimester, really stood out as an important protective factor. So that is really quite remarkable. We didn't find an association, which was a bit surprising, with alcohol consumption. So that was really would have been expected. But it really needs to be highlighted. We're not saying, okay, in that multivariate, alcohol doesn't play a role. It could be potentially be related to methodological reasons. So we looked at any alcohol consumption, but that included, for example, really low doses. If someone only drank 1 glass during the week, for example. So that might be a reason. And also, of course, we might see potential social desirability effects in the reporting. And but that's really important to know, to say we're not saying this doesn't play a role. We also didn't find an association with gestation age and birth complications. But here again, it might be that co-occurrence with birth weight, and it has been found in earlier studies that birth weight is actually the best predictor for any associated cognitive functioning. So again, not saying those other things don't play a role, but it might be because the birth complication is the best predictor in that multivariate approach. Also depression, we would have expected an association. And here again, there might be a co-occurrence with those other maternal mental health characteristics. A couple of limitations we have for the study. So all this antenatal information was based on self-reports from mother during their late pregnancy. So there might be a bit of bias in recalling the information that was especially related to that very early and pre-pregnancy period. In general, there's a selection bias, obviously, of any study. And also we had some missing data due to this longitudinal approach, and comparing those missing cases and the cases with complete data, it's often those with more disadvantaged socio-demographic conditions are often the ones that are dropping out of those longitudinal studies first. So that might obviously bias the findings as well. We didn't control for any parenting characteristics, learning environment, and so on, which obviously will have influenced those associations as well as the outcomes as such. It was a bit beyond the scope of this particular study, but it's definitely something to be looked at. Also, we couldn't take into account earlier cognitive because it really also needs to be mentioned, and it's a retrospective study. So again, the growing up in New Zealand study is not about cognitive functioning. So we kind of had to work with what we had, and it is also really tricky to actually have that longitudinal approach of cognitive functioning in those really early childhood years. So it is really difficult to first of all, finding the same measures, that are not age appropriate. Obviously, it's different how a 2-year-old cognitive function works differently or can be tested only differently compared to a 4.5-year-old. So there are really a lot of things to consider. And then in my other work I did around that, I also found that those early measures we had at 2 years didn't relate to the later the 4.5-year cognitive functioning. So for various reasons, but it is not so easy to really account for that at this early age. A few strengths of the study. So again, it was one of the first that actually looked at this multivariate approach, having really a range of antenatal, environmental, and perinatal features. In those two child observations, we could really control for a large variety of confounding factors, and we have this large, diverse population-based sample, so we can really say we're seeing those kind of effects in a population sample. Back to my earlier model from Bronfenbrenner. So we could really add on to that, really confirming the effects on those different layers and systems. So really highlighting this early first environment plays an important role. We have those individual factors, but also seeing the need to really account for those more distal environmental factors in order to make any conclusions about these associations. Yeah, and what does that mean for future research? So, first, what does it mean for what implications does that have? So obviously there are some factors we can't really change or control or not easily, but there are some modifiable risk factors. So I guess it's actually or one would assume it is well known that, for example, smoking during pregnancy is not ideal, that taking folic acid is recommended, but we still see those numbers. So looking at our data, we saw that 17% of the moms didn't take folic acid during that first trimester, which is concerning. And it was also 11% of the mothers reporting they was smoking during pregnancy, and keeping in mind that might be also underreported. So it's still relatively high numbers. So we still need to work on providing and improving maternal support and education in those spaces. And especially also really regarding maternal mental health. I think that there's still maybe not as much awareness around that it actually can have an effect. We need provide more care and support for mothers in this space to support them along the way, because obviously that will impact on a lot of things in order to be able to take care of themselves, making sure that there is enough care and support provided. So this is something that needs to be worked on still. And in the future, it would be really interesting to see what happens. Like, we gathered ongoing information on maternal mental health. So that could obviously be observed as well. How does that work in the long run? As mentioned, alcohol intake needs further investigation. And currently, just recently, we started a study where I'm also involved in looking at, in much more detail, at this alcohol intake and different doses and how that affects neurocognitive outcomes in the 8-year-old children, where we also have a bit more of a more comprehensive cognitive battery, and especially when it comes, so that is in regard to screening for fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. And those kind of features also seem to emerge or be observable at a bit of a later stage. So at 8 years might be where we might see even more of this association as well. So we have a neurocognitive battery, which we can look at. And again, taking into account and looking at parenting practices, home and learning, education, environment will be another great study to look at in the future. Yeah, so lastly, I would like to thank everyone involved in this project. Obviously, I didn't do this on my own. I had help and support from my lovely team. First and foremost, thank you to my PhD supervisor, Professor Karen Waldy, as well as my co-supervisor, Associate Professor Liz Peterson, and my other co-authors, Lisa Underwood, Sarah Herbert, and Susan Morton, which is the founding director of the Growing Up in New Zealand study. And obviously, big thank you to all the Growing Up in New Zealand participants and their families, without whom studies like this with those important insights wouldn't be possible. And for anyone who is interested in this work, we've published it in Early Human Development in 2019. And yeah, to finish my presentation, I would like to share and recite a Maori proverb, which really speaks to me, and I think really resonates with the work that we are doing. And it goes, "Ma te whakarongo ka mohio, ma te mohio ka marama, ma te marama ka mata, ma te mata ka ora." And this translates to, from listening comes knowledge, from knowledge comes understanding, from understanding comes wisdom, and from wisdom comes well-being. And in this regard, muito obrigada, and thank you so much for listening, and I'm happy to hear any questions. Thank you.
So the only thing about, the online talks is that at the end, we missed this, right? So thank you very much, Denise, for giving us this very interesting, enlightening talk. So I'll just let now my colleague Ingrid Finger, I'll just say a few words before I call her to mediate the session, okay? So Dr. Ingrid Finger is an associate professor at the Modern Languages Department at Universidade Federal do Rio Grande do Sul, the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul, which is the state right after Santa Catarina to the south, Denise, so that you know.
Thank you.
A permanent member of the postgraduate program in languages, Letras. She has both an MA and a PhD in languages, Letras, from the Pontifical Catholic University of Rio Grande do Sul, PUC. She spent her doutorado sanduíche at the City University of New York. Denise, in Brazil, our doctoral students, they have a chance to spend a year abroad, 6 months abroad. So, and it's called the sandwich in the middle of the study. She was a visiting scholar at the Brain and Language Lab at Georgetown University. Her research interests include bilingualism and bilingual education, psycholinguistics, applied linguistics, and neuroscience and education. She investigates language processing and the underlying cognitive processes in unimodal and bimodal bilingualism, analyzing attention, cognitive control, and cognitive memory systems. She's the coordinator of LABICO, Laboratório de Bilinguismo e Cognição, Bilingualism and Cognition Lab at UFSC, and is part of the National Network Science for Education. So thank you very much for having accepted to mediate this session so promptly. So I'll give you the floor, yes, so that you can. All right.
Thank you so much, Leda, for the invitation. It's an immense pleasure to be here. It's always nice to be with you, Leda. And it was really great. I'm sorry, my phone is ringing here. It was really great to hear, Denise. I had the opportunity to read your paper too, and it's an amazing research. I had heard about the Growing Up in New Zealand study, but I didn't know many details about it. And there are lots of things that come to mind when we hear about a study like that. So I do have, while people organize themselves to write their own questions, I'm going to start up with some of my own. So I think the most important thing for me is for us in academia to think about the impact that the research that we do can have in reality, right? Because, the distance between academic studies and, the results that we find and, well-being, like, in the poem you said, it's huge, right? So my first question to you is related to that, because it's a project that has been going on for, I don't know, 16 years, 17 years now, right?
Yeah.
It's a long time. Do you know if there has been any concrete effects in terms of political, from related to health policies to, decisions regarding health issues? I'm not even talking about cognition and language here, because this is a whole new, it's a different area. But in terms of public health, do you know if there has had any, impact or results of the, of the results studies being considered
Yeah,
the
so
government or
yeah, no, thank you for that question. Yeah, that's a really important question, and it's definitely yeah, growing up in New Zealand generally is really closely working. So it's funded by the Ministry of Child Development, and it's yeah, there's a really close collaboration with our government and agencies. So even for every data collection wave we are planning, it is actually, they have some input in what they would like to see or what would be important from their point of view to further explore. So that's always happening as well together with them. And then there's, so we have our general reports, which also you know, feed into what the ministry would like to know about. And then there's also really specific add-on projects for certain research questions that yeah, several agencies would like to see happening. So it is really also really they kind of requesting certain research. That's one angle. So from that side, so really conducting the research specifically for a certain yeah, whatever topic that is really relevant and urgent at the moment. And then there's also policy briefs happening with that information that we're gathering. So it is actually, yeah, quite a close collaboration with our agencies. Yeah, and we are also aiming to increase that translation, because as you said, what does all that research in the end, you know, mean if it never really, if it sits in a paper and then that's it. And so really aiming to increase even more also in our engagement with our communities and participants. So just for that, this research, for this data collection, we have like even put specific hubs also for our different groups. We have a Pacifica hub, we have a Maori hub, to really get people out and into the communities. And it's not just about getting information, but really also about giving back. So that's really something we probably can step up our game still a little bit, but this is all happening as well, so that it really goes back to the people that, yeah, exactly, that they get this really important information. Yeah, definitely.
Developing awareness, right? You know,
exactly.
Some of the issues are very, you know, are very clear, are very evident, like folate, you know, micronutrients, yeah, and alcohol consumption. You know, some things are,
yeah,
are very,
and there has been quite a bit of, yeah, media coverage as well. So in the local national media, that whether it's newspapers and TV and social media. So there's quite a bit of impact there as well, so that it gets out as well. Yeah, so that's definitely happening.
That's nice. What about breastfeeding? Is there any question related to breastfeeding? Is there any question? Yeah, because it's not mentioned in the paper. So I got curious because that seems to be an important factor too. So I got curious whether you also, you know.
Yeah, so we, in that study, we didn't consider it, but yeah, you're totally right. It's also a really important factor. And there are other teams of the research more in the nutrition and health area. They're specifically looking at this closer. Maybe not so much with cognition as an outcome, more general health, I think. Mm-hmm. But yeah, we didn't, in our study, we didn't consider it. But yeah, definitely is an important factor as well, and many more. So again, it's really, we already had quite a bit. It's still limited in what else might affect. But yeah, we kind of also tried needing to find a balance. You know, we can obviously that Bronfenbrenner model, we can't have everything in it, unfortunately. But yeah, there might be a good also suggestion for a future study to look at that particular. Yes.
Ingrid, can I just say something about the impact of the study?
Sure.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So besides being, funded by the government and everything, we cannot forget that this is very viable in New Zealand because, raising this awareness and everything because of the population, which is 5 million?
Yeah, around a bit over 5.
A bit over 5 million. So yeah, besides, everything else, which makes this possible, right? Okay, sorry.
Yeah, the reach is, so we only have, I think, 3, main national TV channels, like 3, 4, 5 or something like that. So really it's not and so the one news that everyone watches that news. So if you're on that news, then everyone sees it. So more or less like that. Yeah, so it's much smaller community. Yeah, totally.
Yeah, it's paradise.
That's nice. So we have one question here from Tatiana. And she says, thank you, Professor Neumann. Congratulations on this incredible enterprise. Longitudinal studies are no easy feat. As far as I understood, you are still collecting data from the children you mentioned. What other measures do you intend to collect from now on? Specifically, what data related to reading do you plan to gather and what ages? And I'm going to add to that academic success. So if you are planning to look at reading, but also academic success, at some point.
Yeah, so that's a good question. So definitely, the 4.5 obviously wasn't the end. So we had the next bigger one was at 8. And there we had this more comprehensive cognitive battery, and that included a similar vocabulary test, but also a reading comprehension test as well. So that was that as part of that battery. For the 12th year, we actually, unfortunately, so that this cognitive battery was quite comprehensive at 8, and it again, it is always this trade-off, getting information and versus keeping the participant burden as low as possible. So for the 12th year, unfortunately, we couldn't repeat that again. So we are planning to have a bit of a, we are mainly just focusing on the inhibitory control and attention flanker task as a kind of a broader overall, cognitive functioning. And but the education domain will be is more important now. Not actually too sure if we really specifically go into reading as such. It's more about, so we definitely have, we'll assess around, educational achievement and self-concept and all that. But I think we don't have a reading anything about. I don't want to say anything false, but I think, no, I don't think we going that much into detail at this 12th year. Yeah. It's more about the general, general achievement. But we also have a teacher questionnaire actually in planning. So there might be some there as well. Yeah. So that's unfortunately, that's often, that's kind of the only disadvantage of this longitudinal studies. So you can't really have one area too much in depth because you need every kind of little bit of everything. So yeah, that's why. But we are really happy we have this 8 year. This will be, I think there will a lot of studies will still follow on that one because we really have that comprehensive cognitive battery, including the crystallized and the fluid kind of areas. So that will be really exciting for us to further explore.
I was thinking about more complex measures of language production, not just reception, like, things related to things that we could analyze through softwares like graph analysis. I've been doing some graph analysis later in the past few months, and it's really interesting because it's a tool that you can use to analyze large chunks of data, right? So basically what you need is like 30-second speech of each child, like looking at pictures and narrating a story or narrating a dream or narrating a tale or something. Like you just record and then you can process large amounts of data, right? And that could be an alternative, now that they are 12, and if you are still following up on the study. So perhaps, it would be nice to use other methodologies, other, tools that could help you look at, look at things, because one thing is to go and apply a Peabody test to each child, and another thing is to have them record a 30-second, dream that they had, or a story, a bedtime story, that their favorite bedtime story, whatever, So it's a much easier way to collect data with a large bunch of kids, and you still, have, interesting stuff to look at. So,
no, that's awesome suggestion. We might get back to you, because that's actually one of the challenges, especially now the children getting older, and kind of finding new ways of engaging, like still getting information, but also really make it engaging and interesting for our participants. So we always thought there's even actually another add-on project that just explores new possibilities to engage with those young people and make this a good experience for them. So that might be something to consider as well. Sounds awesome.
That's really cool. I'm going to put you in contact with Natalia
Awesome.
Mota from Instituto do Cérebro from Natal, and she's developed this software which is called Speech Graphs, and they have very interesting studies being published at Mind and Brain Education, like two studies and some other studies. And we've been doing graph analysis. We've just submitted a paper related to that. One of my master's students is here attending this talk, and she's also using this software to analyze her data with translators. And it's a tool that we can use with oral data and also with writing, kids writing. So maybe that is an alternative, right? Because you have such an interesting sample and it's so rich, and it's so hard to conduct longitudinal studies. So we have to try to make it easier for us to be able to analyze such a large amount of data, right? And it's nice to be able to look 12 years back, to factors like that. So it's
exactly.
really
That's awesome. Thank you for this suggestion.
It's nice. It's nice.
Happy to hear more about that. Awesome.
And I don't know if there are any other questions. I don't think there are.
So no questions on YouTube, right, Tatiana?
Okay, so I have one more then. Because I found this really, really interesting. So I've always heard that depression is a very important factor that affects cognitive development in children. Depression in their mothers, maternal depression has a very large impact, right, on cognition. And so you didn't find that, right? You found other aspects, which are very interesting, but you didn't find maternal depression as a permanent risk for cognitive and social emotional problems, right? And you mentioned that, perhaps, there were some intervening factors that may have resulted to that. But I'm just wondering here, Joe, I'm just curious, so I was wondering whether you think that this has anything to do with, levels of overall depression levels in the country, or any other, socioeconomic factors. So what is your intake on this thing? I just read, like, last week, I think I read a paper. I don't know if you know the Lombok, Indonesia study, the Cohort Lombok, Indonesia study by Elizabeth Prado and Anu Shankar.
I think part of it, yeah.
Elizabeth Prado and Michael Ullman, my advisor, when I went to Georgetown, I worked with him. So Michael Ullman is one of the others. So I know a lot about the study because of that. So it's a study in Indonesia. It's a cohort study, which was started in 2001. And it looked at over 40,000 pregnant women. And then they looked at the effects of multiple micronutrients, not just folate, but like a richer supplement. And first they looked at cognitive measures, in the mother and the children. And now the last paper that they have just published, the children are 12, from 9 to 12, right? And they are, they examine lots of different cognitive measures as well as socioeconomic outcomes in the children. One of the factors that had an impact is home environment, exactly like you were planning to look at more at. But they also found that maternal depression was the factor that interacted with everything. Like, in all ages, that's the permanent risk factor in comparison to all other factors. There were more individual difference, but maternal depression was the one that was prevalent in all ages, and this is really interesting. So,
yeah, definitely. I think, definitely, as you said, there will be many interlinks, within our socioeconomic measures as well, and those factors we didn't account for. So, there's kind of this discussion that it is a twofolded way, that during pregnancy there might be increased stress hormones that might affect the child development as one more biological angle, but then there's also obviously this whole interaction between parenting styles and maybe any other environmental factors. So that is definitely also can have an effect. And again, we might also be having to look at that a bit further with our 8-year measures. So our 4.5-year ones are a bit limited. So at 8 years we have this more comprehensive data. So that might be another future project to look at that a little bit closer. And we also actually have information on the child's mental health as well, first time at 8 years. So which obviously also will be interlinked. So there's definitely much more to explore. And again, it might be this really overlap as well, that we don't specifically see it in that multivariate approach, although we did see it in the bivariate. So depression definitely comes up there. Yeah, definitely.
That's wonderful. Good luck with the study. It's you know, it's really cool. It's very informative. It's very relevant. It's very hard to do something like that and to keep working on a project, a large scale project for so many years. So I wish you guys all the best, and you know, thank you so much for such a nice talk. It was really, really cool. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you. Much appreciated.
Okay, Ingrid, thank you very much for all your questions, your insights, thank you. Denise, before I close the session, I'd just like to, just curiosity, because you said that you collected data from the fathers. Yeah. So, because I was thinking especially about how living, the fathers are there, they're living with the mother, and they are having an impact on the mother's mental health. So I don't know. So I was thinking, so what data did you collect from the fathers? And
also quite similar to the moms at the but only at the antenatal and the 2 years. And now we are again now at 12 years. We also are planning to go back to the partners of the mothers. So or should say primary caregiver. So it's not always the mother. But yeah, so that's definitely we wanting to re-engage with as well, as you said, is such an important information as well. Nothing happens in isolation. And yeah, it's obviously a little bit, you know, this big study, there are funding constraints at some point as well. So you can't do everything always. So we have this we were lucky having those information from the partners at antenatal and 2 years, also regarding their mental health as well. So that might be, and it actually has been looked at that it is actually actually even more dads experiencing antenatal and postnatal depression as well. So it's definitely all interlinked again. So that's something also to follow up. And yeah, really hoping, actually doing it now as well, again at 12 years, re-engaging with the partners. Yeah, that is really important. And similar.
sorry. Sorry.
No, that's all right. That's
Okay, so I was also thinking about the fact that we did not find it an impact of alcohol consumption. So yeah, I think you mentioned the doses, the quantity. So how much? Maybe those moms just had one, like 100 milliliters. I don't know.
Yeah.
Or 50 milliliters.
Yeah, so we will need to group that into those that kind of, it's not really, there's no really standard and how to group it, but there's a common used, having those 3 kind of categories, low, medium, and high guidelines. So we can, so that's something we are actually looking at now, at least for the 8-year outcomes. With this comprehensive neurocognitive battery for screening of the FASD. And those, and it has been found that it is actually at 8 where it actually starts really emerging and is detected on the neurocognitive level. So that might also be one of the reasons we might not see certain things at the 4.5 years, because there's also still so much variability in the children's functions, whereas at 8 it is a bit more distinguished and developed. So we might also see some of the effects maybe only at a later stage.
Okay. All right, so thank you very much, Denise, once again, for having accepted so promptly, for giving us this very nice, very enriching, enlightening talk. So yeah, Tatiana is just reminding all of us, the next talk we're going to have is with Dr. Regine Polinsky from the Université Libre de Bruxelles. I don't know how to pronounce that. It's on October 7th, 10 a.m. Okay. Does literacy impact high-level cognitive function? So Denise, you are also invited.
Thank you.
10 a.m. in Brazil is going to be like, let me see, 10.
Yeah.
Oh, my goodness, this is so crazy.
It's the middle of the night.
Middle of the night.
Okay.
Yeah, middle
I
of the
see.
night. Okay, and then our last talk for this cycle is going to be in November with Dr. Mary Helen Modino-Young, and she works with emotions, learning, neuroscience, and education, and very, very nice. So we hope you can all be here. Thank you once again. You know, Denise, Ingrid, Tatiana here, Harissa, and all everyone, you know, who is here with us and also on YouTube. Thank you very much, and hope to see you next time. And Denise, so have a nice day in New Zealand. Here we have a nice evening. Oh, and by the way, thank you so much for learning all these words in Portuguese. Just
Yeah,
thank you.
that was so thoughtful.
It wasn't much,
Yeah.
just a little bit. So,
Oh.
yeah, once again, muito obrigada. Thank you so much.
De nada. De nada.
That's so cool. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So bye-bye, everyone. See you next time. Bye.